Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show, we take a look at some of the stranger and scarier witches of past and present that linger and lurk inside the deep, dark woods, and have the creatures that also lurk within those woods do their evil bidding. Thank you ever so much for all of you who have recently shared and liked and commented. A big welcome to all of the new family members here at DMT as well. We are very fastly approaching the 5k mark, and we've got some special treats in store for you all there, soon to be announced. Remember, if you would like me to narrate a story of your own, whether that be a true experience or a fictional story, or if you need help and advice, get in touch with me at dmtforestoffear@gmail.com. Without further ado, guys, let's get into tonight's first story, entitled The Witch of Whispering Woods. Let's get straight into that. I'm an 80-year-old woman with a body that's winding down, but a mind that remains sharp as a tack. My memory is brilliant, perhaps a little too brilliant, as I am prone to remembering things I would rather forget, such as the day I encountered the Witch of Whispering Woods. This isn't a story I've told many people, and for the longest time I believed I would take it to my grave, but the burden has grown too heavy for my withered shoulders to bear, and all I want to do is live out my final years in peace. God knows I need it. I grew up in a small Massachusetts town I will not name. Raised in a middle-class family with 5 children. I was the baby, and my parents and siblings spoiled me. We lived in a small brick house on the edge of town, backed by acres of thick forest. That forest was known as Whispering Woods, and had been the topic of childhood nightmares for generations. Even if you don't live in Massachusetts, or America for that matter, you have likely heard about the Salem witch trials. Well, our town wasn't far from Salem, and we had a dark history of our own. According to local law, a witch had been hanged in Whispering Woods, and her wrathful spirit still lingered about. As a little girl, those stories terrified me to no end, and I made sure to stay out of Whispering Woods. I imagined all manner of grotesque creatures hiding in the shadows, and I pictured the witch herself as a gnarled old hag with glowing red eyes and teeth like butcher's knives. I remember this one time. I was playing ball with my sister, Janet. I threw it too far, and it disappeared into the tree line. Janet went to retrieve it, and watching the brush swallow her up sent me into hysterics. I was convinced the witch would come and take my big sister away, never to be seen again. Fortunately, as I matured, my fears began to subside. By the fall of 1951, when I was 14 years old, I no longer believed in the Witch of Whispering Woods. The stories I had heard seemed silly and nonsensical. And besides, I was too busy with school and friends to let my imagination run wild. Still, Whispering Woods made me uneasy, and I continued to avoid the place. That is, until Marjorie Hill dared my best friend, Patricia, and I to spend the night there. Marjorie Hill was a loud, boisterous tomboy with long legs and a shock of curly red hair. She had a deep voice and a booming laugh, and never seemed to shut up. Patricia and I found her obnoxious, and Marjorie knew this, so she went out of her way to annoy us both. Bet you couldn't last a minute in the Whispering Woods, she taunted us in the schoolyard one morning. You'd both run out, crying. Go away, Marjorie, I snapped. Now, don't be like that. She thumped my back, nearly knocking me right over. It's not my fault you're such a baby. You're just a bully. I dare you, Marjorie smirked. I dare both of you to spend the night in Whispering Woods. My mouth dried up. The dam within me broke, and all of my memories of childhood terror came flowing out. I began to shake, and Patricia put her arm around me. See, you are scared. Shut up, I yelled at her. I'll do it. As much as the thought horrified me, I couldn't give Marjorie the satisfaction of seeing me so afraid. Patricia looked at me like I'd gone mad, but all I could focus on was Marjorie's freckled face, as it went from smug to shocked. Really? She stammered. You'll do it? Yes, but on one condition. My brother comes with us. Gerald was a year older than me, tall and built like an army tank. Despite his imposing appearance, he was a gentle giant, but not afraid to get his hand dirty if need be. I'd feel much safer with him around. "Fine, bring Gerald," said Marjorie. She whirled around and started to walk away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder at Patricia and I. "Oh, and I'm coming too. I have to make sure you guys don't try anything funny." "Lorraine," Patricia whispered once Marjorie was out of sight. "Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted. "But maybe if we prove that we aren't babies, she'll leave us alone." I'm aware of the thoughts in my own logic, but remember, I was young and prideful, and my anger had clouded my judgment. Now, looking back, I realised that taking Marjorie's dare was the biggest mistake of my life. I wish more than anything that I could go back in time and change what happened, set events rolling in a different direction. By telling you my story, I'm also confessing my wrongdoings, and although I don't expect forgiveness, I hope you can understand why I did what I did. The plan was to set up camp in Whispering Woods and spend the whole night there, leaving only after the sun came up. When I told my parents about the plan, they were sceptical. Given my past fear of the woods, I didn't tell them about the dare. Patricia and I thought it might be fun, I lied. Besides, we'll have Gerald with us. It took some convincing, but eventually my parents agreed, as long as we didn't go too deep into the woods. I called Patricia, and she told me her parents had also agreed to the trip. Everything was set, and at 5:30 the following evening, Gerald and I left our house with our tent, food, water and sleeping bags, and whatever else we might need. We met up at the head of the main trail with Marjorie and Patricia. It was Marjorie, of course, who took the lead. "We'll camp out in the clearing," she announced. The tree they hanged the witch from used to stand there, but after she died, the bark turned black and the surrounding grass turned dry and yellow, so the townspeople cut it down, believing it to be cursed. "You just made that up," I accused. "No, I didn't. It's true." We walked the trail in relative silence. I marvelled at how normal Whispering Woods appeared, with its towering trees and leafy green bushes. Birds chirped up in the branches and squirrels scurried around in a bush. It didn't look anything like a haunted forest at all. That said, there was still something sinister in the air, clinging to us like thick, black smoke. Patricia clung to my arm, her body stiff as a board, fear crackling beneath her skin like electricity. Gerald kept his hands shoved into his pockets. His face was pale and tight-lipped. Only Marjorie remained unaffected, skipping along and humming to herself. The sky had turned hazy purple with the twilight by the time we arrived at the clearing. We set up camp, and I helped Gerald build a fire. I found myself jumping at every snapping twig, every bird call. My terror of this place was creeping back in, and Marjorie noticed and began to laugh. "Poor Lorraine," she sneered. "I knew you wouldn't last." "Leave her alone," said Gerald. "Look," Marjorie pointed. "There's the stump of the old tree." The four of us walked over to investigate. The stump had dozens of rings, indicating it was very old. Marjorie groaned and muttered, "It looks normal." "See, you did make the story up." "Did not." Okay. Gerald waved a hand between us. "Let's just get back to camp." We cooked dinner and sat around the fire for a while, talking about everything and nothing. By that point, the sky was pitch black, veiled in clouds, with no moon or stars in sight. Whispering Woods had gone silent around us. There wasn't much as a single cricket chirping. Patricia bumped her knee against mine and whispered, "I have to go to the bathroom." "So go." "No." Patricia shook her head. "I don't want to go alone." "Okay, I'll come with you." We excused ourselves and walked across the clearing to a small clump of bushes. I turned away to give my friend some privacy, while keeping an eye on the flickering fire. Gerald and Marjorie were huddled close together, in a way that seemed a little too intimate. The thought of Marjorie Hill dating my brother made me sick to my stomach. "Lorraine," Patricia whispered. "Lorraine, come over here." I looked. She was standing on the opposite side of the bushes, and although I could only make out shadows and shapes, I sensed that she was genuinely spooked. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice crackling midway through. "Come here." I went to stand next to her, clicking on my flashlight and casting it across the forest floor. I was not prepared for what I found. the biggest buck I had ever seen, sprawled at our feet. Its neck was bent at a grotesque angle. Its swollen purple tongue bulged out, and pink, slimy intestines spilled out of a hideous gash along its belly. I dry heaved, my hands clutching my stomach. Patricia began to cry. She loved animals and couldn't stand seeing them hurt. I put my arm around her and guided her back to camp. "What's wrong?" Gerald demanded, jumping to his feet. "Dead deer," I mouthed over Patricia's curly, strawberry blonde hair. My brother took my flashlight from me and went to investigate himself. Patricia and I sat down next to Marjorie, who was braiding blades of grass together. A minute later, Gerald came back, looking pale. "What on earth could have done that?" he gasped. "A wolf? Or maybe it was a bear. I don't know." "Maybe we should leave," said Marjorie. "This was your idea," I reminded her, "although I wouldn't mind leaving these woods, not at all." "The carcass did look fresh," said Gerald. "It might not be safe." He was cut off by a shrill, blood-curdling scream from the direction of the dead buck. It was so loud it made the leaves on the trees shake. I clamped my hands around my ears and fell back, while Patricia gripped my arm like a vice and wailed. Gerald shouted for us to stay calm. Marjorie jumped up and ran like every demon in hell was chasing her. "Hey!" I screamed. "Get back here, you coward!" "What the hell is she doing?" Gerald hollered. Patricia shrieked and pointed. Gerald and I followed her gaze to two tiny pinpricks of light floating between the two trees. The realization that they were eyes hit me like a freight train, and my legs gave out. I collapsed to my knees, shaking, and Gerald put his hand on my back. "Get up, Lorraine, come on, get up!" Behind the eyes came an animalistic hiss. There was a rustling in the bushes, soft footsteps that sounded like gunfire in the dark. The thing moved closer, those eerie glowing eyes on us. Slowly, form began to emerge. In the orange glow of the fire I could make out a human shape, but not much beyond that. When Gerald reached for his flashlight, I screamed "No!" at him, but it was too late. My brother cast the light directly onto the thing before him, bellowing, "Run!" Him, Patricia, and I took off. The horrible abomination gave chase, snarling and hissing like a cat. I had seen it. In the split second between Gerald shining his flashlight and yelling at Patricia and I to run, I had seen the Witch of Whispering Woods. How I managed to process so much detail in such a short time span is a mystery to me. But whatever the case, the image of that creature has been seared into my mind like those brands put on cattle. The witch was ghastly pale, with eyes that glowed like twin stars, and a gaping maw filled with jagged yellow teeth. Wisps of flyaway hair clung precariously to her scalp. Her neck was abnormally long. Her back was so hunched that she moved like a gorilla, bony, knuckled hands scraping the forest floor. She howled, hissed and shrieked and cackled as she lumbered after us. We kept on running, screaming for help, even though we knew no one would hear us. At one point I lost my shoes. Sharp rocks, twigs and even brambles cut my feet, but my terror drowned out the pain. My lungs were on fire, my throat was raw from screaming. I thought I knew true fear. How wrong I was. A root caught my foot and sent me sprawling face first. My nose broke, spilling hot, coppery blood down my chin. Gerald and Patricia, who hadn't noticed, disappeared around the bend in the trail. Immediately, I felt the witch's hot, rancid breath on the back of my neck. She twisted her gnarled fingers into my hair and wrenched my head back. I screamed as loud as I could, but to no avail. The witch brought her dry, blackened lips to my ear and hissed in my ear. I'm not ashamed to admit my bladder let go. The sharp scent of urine mixed with the foul aroma of the witch's breath, and I nearly passed out. Just as the witch clamped her vicious teeth around my neck, Gerald came tearing back down the trail, his fists swinging, his face red and twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. With one powerful thrust of his leg, he kicked the witch in the head, hard enough that her neck snapped back with an ear-splitting crack. The witch shrieked and dug her talons into my back, piercing my skin. Gerald kicked her again, and finally the horrible creature rolled off me. "Come on!" Gerald yelled. I staggered to my feet, and so did the witch. Her neck was snapped in two, just like the buck's, but she seemed unfazed. Her eyes blazing, her lips curled back in a furious snarl. "Go!" Gerald bellowed. I took off again, sobbing hysterically, knowing my brother probably wouldn't come back. I caught up with Patricia, who had collapsed, crying and vomiting up her dinner. We heard thundering footsteps and looked up to see a mob of men from the town approaching. One of them scooped me up and cradled me close. Father. It's okay, little one, he cooed, his normally gruff voice gentle and serene. It's okay. I tried to tell him that Gerald was still in the woods with that thing, but I could only babble incoherently, unable to string together a coherent sentence. Thankfully, Father seemed to understand. He handed me to my mother and followed the other men into Whispering Woods, each carrying a weapon, charging like soldiers into battle. Most of the town, it seemed, had gathered at the edge of the woods. I saw Marjorie sobbing in her mother's arms and wanted to scream at her for leaving us behind, but I couldn't. I knew she was the one who had alerted the townspeople to our situation, and for that I had to be grateful. From the woods came an ungodly cacophony of screams and gunshots. Smoke rose from the treetops, and I swore I could smell blood. 5 minutes later, Father returned, clutching shredded masses of blood, flesh and fabric that had once been my brother. That was when I passed out. Gerald was buried in the town cemetery. He and 4 others died in the woods that night. The men had shot at the witch until she retreated, growling and dripping blood. Our campsite was discovered the next day, all our belongings torn to shreds. Fragments of the witch's fingernails were found embedded in my back. My broken nose never healed quite right, and years later, when plastic surgery became an option, I chose not to have it corrected. I wanted to remember what I'd been through, what had happened that night. Mother was catatonic for months after Gerald's death. Marjorie's family left town a year later, leaving the carnage behind. Patricia and I remained best friends, our bond deepened by our horrific ordeal. Years passed. I married and moved to Boston, raising a family of my own. I would often visit my childhood home, of which I still had countless good memories, but I could never escape the shock of what I'd seen, the guilt of what I'd done. To this day, I blame myself for my brother's death. Whispering Woods still stands to this day, as if nothing ever happened. I know the witch is still there. I wonder if she remembers us. I wonder if she knows Patricia and I are still alive. The wounds on my back left ugly, purple scars. On the anniversary of that night, they tingle and burn. Every now and then, I have nightmares of that horrible face leering at me from the shadows. I can still hear the sounds that creature made as it chased us. I can still feel and smell her breath. So there you have it. That's the story of my night in Whispering Woods. The story of how my brother died to protect me. The story of the scars on my back. I don't blame Marjorie for what happened. She didn't truly believe there was a witch in Whispering Woods, and she couldn't have known what would happen. I haven't seen her since she moved away. I wonder where she is now. If she's even still alive. Does she blame herself too? This past week, Patricia passed away from old age. I returned to town for her funeral, and after the mourners had left, went to visit Gerald's grave. "Take care of Patricia once she gets to heaven," I whispered, "just like you took care of me." As I turned and walked away, I swear I felt a strong hand on my back, pushing me forward, but it was probably just the wind. Little Wolf. "So, tell me, little wolf," the voice crooned from the darkness, "do you want to punish those who have wronged you?" The young girl looked up from where she sat, huddled inside a pentagram drawn in ash, her face stained with tears and blood. Her fiery hair was matted with dirt, and she had streaks of soot running up and down her arms. She glanced around her, surveying the ruins of her once beautiful home, where there had been a vibrance of colours and warmth. Now there was only the burned husk of her former life. She was silent for a long moment, features blank with shock and grief. Suddenly, her eyes snapped up to the shrouded figure towering over her. Her gaze was flat and unwavering as she gave a single nod. The figure laughed darkly, its skeletal fingers wrapped around a charred wooden beam that had once supported the gabled roof of the girl's simple cottage. The figure seemed to drift in and out of view, its edges curling like smoke with the wind. Its essence shifted continuously. The only constant was the ebony hand emerging from the darkness. The girl didn't try to follow the shift, keeping her attention firmly on the hard fingers tapping out a steady rhythm on the beam. "You know not what you ask, little wolf. The price for what you desire It's steep, called the voice from the darkness. The girl flinched back from its voice. The rough sound was like a broken glass, grinding against her psyche. I know the cost. They need to pay for this, the things they have destroyed, the girl replied, her voice remarkably steady, even as her hand shook. The figure lapsed into what could pass for a contemplative silence, as if it were having an internal debate. The only sounds that could be heard were the constant tapping of the skeletal fingers on the wood and the rush of the girl's blood in her ears. Finally, the tapping ceased, and a decision had been made. You will receive what you wish for, the figure said softly, but there will be no return from what you have become. The girl simply stared. If you are certain, the figure continued slowly. The girl stared into the darkness with a fire in her eyes fueled by hatred. I am. The figure seemed to nod, accepting this. Then you will have your wish. I will give you the power you desire to revenge yourself upon your enemies. You will walk this earth for eternity, a terrible creature of blood and torment. You will live even as your enemies die, until even the sun itself is consumed and this universe is devoured. Never will you find rest. Do you accept these terms and entrust your soul to me? Without hesitation, the girl replied, I accept. Very well, the figure said, and vanished in a storm of darkness. The girl stared sightlessly at where it had stood, then looked around the desolate surroundings as if for the first time. She saw the burned interior of her home. She saw the comfortable rooms her family had once occupied, where memories had been made. She winced as she realized that those memories were all she had left. She felt pain and hatred flood her body when she thought of what had been taken from her. Her peaceful home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the beauty of nature and filled with love and safety. Her family, who had been condemned to the flames as witches for nothing more than using white magic to help others. The young girl smiled bitterly. Her family had been executed for practicing white magic, while she herself had escaped to summon a terrible power that would enable her to destroy those who had taken so much from her. They had created what they had attempted to destroy, a dark witch. A searing pain tore through the witch suddenly, leaving her doubled in pain. Her face pressed into the ash coating the floor as she gasped for air. She dug her fingers deep into the earth below. As her body shuddered and quaked, she felt a violent tearing inside her, as though a part of her body was being ripped away. She clutched at her chest, but the pain didn't lessen. Instead, it seemed to intensify. She screamed and a burst of white light rushed from her chest. She drifted through the air before disappearing as quickly as it had come. She collapsed, gasping, as the familiar voice whispered close to her ear. Little wolf, the deal is complete. Rise and be revenged. Ravi, the first dark witch in centuries, rose to her feet. She examined her body, distantly aware that she no longer felt any pain. Her nails had grown long and sharp, and the strange feeling in her mouth alerted her to the irregular number of teeth she now possessed. She felt an absence inside of her, like a deep well that had dried and become barren. She suspected that was where her soul had previously resided. She did not miss its weight. She stretched, her joints cracking unnaturally. She stepped out of her pentagram carefully and spared one last glance around the desecrated hovel. Ravi no longer felt the anguish that had accompanied her, the sight mere moments before. She turned and walked away from the cottage that had once been her home. As she did, she passed the still smoking pyre where her family had once consigned to the flames. With a flick of her fingers, Ravi destroyed it, scattering the ashes to the wind. She stalked toward the village where her enemies lived, contempt written across her face. The first house she came upon, a quaint farmhouse, began to smoke as she passed. As her own home had smoked and burned, the crops around it withered and died, and the livestock foamed at the mouth before collapsing. Ravi continued her deadly march towards the town. Where she stepped, the grass shriveled as the very life was drained from it. While she walked, she conjured the faces of those who had wronged her. The baker, who had so often come to her family for advice and healing remedies. He had wielded a torch under the pier as her parents burned. The seamstress, who had passed her time gossiping with Ravi's mother for years. Ravi remembered the woman's sneering face as she threw kindling onto the flames. The last face she pictured was that of the ironsmith's daughter. This had been the ultimate betrayal. Ravi had loved the smith's daughter for as long as she could remember, and always imagined the feelings were reciprocated. Ravi felt her anger burn brighter as she pictured the look on the girl's face when Ravi's parents had been dragged kicking and screaming from their home. Ravi reached the town, and she stepped onto the cobbled main road and slowed to a stop. She peered around her, searching the town that had seemed so welcoming once upon a time. She had flashes of memories, but dismissed them as soon as they emerged. Ravi's roaming eyes alighted onto the baker's shop, and she smiled unpleasantly, her lips stretched tightly over the too many teeth. Strolling toward the bakery, she snapped her fingers casually. The door blew inward, and Ravi walked in to see the baker cowering behind the counter. "Hello, baker," Ravi rasped. Even to her own ears her voice sounded like sandpaper on a chalkboard. The baker cringed back in fear as Ravi continued her slow approach. "You know why I'm here, little man," she crooned. "You know what I need." "Please, Ravi, you don't have to do this. Your family, I'm sorry for what happened to them." Ravi barked a harsh laugh. "Apologies, little man. Too little, too late." She stepped lightly toward the baker, who was attempting to cram his considerable bulk further behind the counter. Ravi smiled, her too wide smile, and fell upon him gleefully. There was a brief scream that ended in an abrupt staccato note. When Ravi stood, there was nothing left of the baker but a bloody apron. Ravi exited the bakery and continued her march of death through the town. The shoemaker perished in a sudden and inexplicable tornado that appeared over his shop before vanishing. The local barkeep drowned in a flash flood that swept him away as he walked toward the tavern. The seamstress burst into flame as she attempted to take in her dress. Her shoes were the only part of her that remained. Wherever Ravi tread, death followed. Plants, animals, and people were drained of life, and still Ravi walked. She made her way through the town, taking the life of every living thing in the vicinity. Finally, her steps brought her to the final destination, the smith's workshop. She heard the clanging of the metal and felt the heat of the forge as she drew near. The smith was bent over an anvil while he hammered a sword made of red with heat. He did not look up as Ravi entered. "Ravi," the smith said calmly, in a lieu of greeting. "Hello, smith," she replied coldly. "You are not welcome here," the smith said, still hammering the sword. "I am not welcome anywhere. It does not stop me from going where I please," Ravi retorted. "I will not allow you to harm my daughter. She never intended this to happen." Ravi laughed, a horrible sound that spoke to her rage. "I care not what she intended. My family died because of her cowardice. If she had not told others those vile lies about my family, lies about their magic, then this all could have been avoided. But she did lie, and her lies caused my family to burn." The smith ceased hammering and finally looked at the witch. He took in her ruined clothes, the ash mixed with blood coating her body. He nodded slowly. "You have done a terrible thing, girl," he said sadly. "I know what I've done," she spat. "I know also what has to be done to me. I see the mistakes I made in trusting your daughter. I don't intend to make those mistakes again." The smith hefted the sword and looked at Ravi in the eyes. "If you want her, you will have to go through me." Ravi snorted, and with a flash of her long nails, the smith's throat erupted into a wash of blood. The man clutched his throat soundlessly before collapsing. He lay still on the floor, and Ravi stepped over his body carelessly and ventured further into the shop. She heard rustling from below and followed the sound. On silent feet, she stalked her prey. Ravi emerged into the basement and stood for a moment listening. After a time, she located the sound of the muffling crying coming from a corner cabinet. She approached the cabinet and wrenched it open violently. There was a brief scream from inside before Ravi yanked the girl from the perceived safety of the cabinet. The smith's daughter wailed when Ravi grabbed her. The witch's touch caused the girl's skin to bubble and blister. Ravi, no! Please don't do this! The young girl cried. I didn't want anything like this to happen. You have to believe me! Ravi glared at the girl contemptuously. The only thing I have to do is live. Everything else is optional. The girl tried to pull away, but Ravi's grip was unrelenting. Ravi, I am so sorry. Please don't. I love you, and I know you loved me once. The smith's daughter croaked and choked through her fear and pain. Maybe I did once, Ravi said softly. But now the only thing I feel is hatred. With these words, Ravi lowered her face to the girl's and sucked the life from her body, leaving the smith's daughter an empty shell. Ravi floated out of the forge into the night that carried the acrid scent of smoke and a metallic stench of blood. She stood in the centre of the empty town and began to laugh. The sound was enough to drive any sane man mad. If there had been anyone left alive to hear it. The laughter finally tapered off as a mass of solid darkness began to form in front of her. A skeletal hand emerged, grasping a staff, and a figure stood silently, considering the deserted village. You have been revenged, little wolf. But I sense this is still not enough to quench your rage. No, I still feel the same burning inside of me. It is insatiable, Ravi replied hungrily. She no longer felt any fear of the figure, only a recognition of the mutual darkness they now shared. The figure tapped its bony fingers on the staff, once, twice, 3 times. I cannot unleash you freely upon the world, little wolf. Your rage is too great. Nothing will be enough. You would decimate the world in your quest for blood, and still it would not stop you. The figure said gravely. So, I must condemn you to this place. You will be trapped here, queen of this dead land, until the world ceases to exist. Ravi screamed in rage and lunged for the figure, but it vanished before she could reach it. She felt the finality of the figure's absence, and she knew she was truly alone in a town inhabited only by the dead. She was doomed to this place of lifeless things until the sun was consumed and the earth stopped turning. She sank to the ground and surveyed the destruction she had wrought. Even with the pain and the death that she had caused, she wanted more death, more desecration. She knew this was impossible thanks to the dark figure. Unless... Ravi smiled, her teeth glowing white in the darkness. The figure had trapped her here, true, but it could not stop her from luring others in. Ravi flowed smoothly to her feet and transformed herself. No longer was she a terrifying creature, coated in blood and gore. Now she was beautiful, a maiden with beautiful dark hair and amber skin. She conjured a comfortable throne from which she ruled her kingdom of the dead. She cast a glamour over the empty town, making it seem warm and inviting to anyone who passed through. Finally, she sent out a call beyond the borders of her kingdom, tempting people around the world to come to this small village they had never heard of. Some would not heed the call, but some... Ravi smiled. The dark witch sat back upon her throne and waited. The witch. Let's get straight into that. I found this information from a friend's cousin who actually went there. He told my friend, and he told us when we met at the party. This is so dangerous. I can't use the names, but I'll try to describe it the best I can. The first thing you should do is ask yourself whether you really need to deal with that witch. It's not for anyone. She can solve minor problems, but the price wouldn't be worth it. Usually, people shouldn't even talk to such people, but if you must, I can only tell you what the friend's friend said. You should get there by car, as taxi drivers are specifically instructed not to take customers there. They won't take the fare if you tell them where you're going. Some will even advise you not to go. The house is at the outskirts, standing alone on a field next to a large forest. It's creepy at night and there is little lighting to be found. It's as if the light dims as you draw closer to her house. Time itself seems to pass in a weird way. I swear, some people look at their wristwatch and notice time passing erratically. You get to the house with no fence. There's no need for one. Nobody dares rob that witch. Nobody is that stupid. A friend told us that the first thing you notice is just how beautiful the witch was. Her cousin remained speechless for a while. The witch wore sunglasses. I heard it's because her eyes can paralyse someone. Others say that it gives you a heart attack. Nobody looked into her eyes. It's like gazing into the eyes of the devil. Make no mistake, that witch is evil. So tread carefully. Unlike 99% of fake psychics and wizards out there, this one is real. And that's the scariest thing. That magic power exists, that they can change things, they can act against nature. Such powers are rare, but the few who possess them are not heard of. Indeed, that witch, whose name I dare not mention, for even writing it can cause harm, displayed them. There were accidents. Some ended up in asylums, plagued by twisted visions or followed by entities. Others witnessed as their once beloved husbands or wives began to shift behaviour and attack them. As hypnotised or like zombies, she controls them from a distance. Fires broke out, and others became sick. She once caused a plague to sweep among the homeless. You can read about it. It was in 1995. That's how dangerous she is. Some say her house is haunted. Some saw shadows fleeting at her windows or faces without bodies. I cannot say how true this is. The witch has a mirror room. There's 100 of them. They're all covered. My friend saw painted windows and doors that ended up nowhere. Wolves come to her home from the woods. They act submissively. Even these animals know to fear her. She treats them good. My friend said his cousin saw a black wolf in the living room. The witch petted it, and it was like a dog to her. It growled ferociously at the customer, and it did not attack, but just seeing it was horrible. You always have to pay a price for her services. A price in gold. Always gold. Gold bars or gold coins. Her behaviour is not evil. It's not rude or simple. On the contrary, it's a manner of speaking that makes you feel like you're talking to an old friend. She's polite and careful and very, very educated. A vast knowledge on all topics. The speech is soft, but full of poison indeed. Nobody heard of a more cunning person. A master of manipulation, but it's hidden beneath the honeyed words. The witch's words are nice. If you don't pay, nothing bad happens. There are no threats made, but I heard tales of a customer who didn't feel like paying for a spell. He laughed at her, and I don't really think he believed some harm could happen. As days passed, he started to eat less and less. He just wasn't hungry. He lost a lot of weight, and he saw doctors, and he began to eat a lot more. But the more he ate, the thinner he got, because he wouldn't pay out of pride. He was cursed. After a few weeks of not seeing his friends, the client was found lying in bed as a skeleton. Not once did he consider paying his debt. Another one was cursed because he mocked her. He said she was not real. He ridiculed her on his blog. The curse manifested itself in that of a customer. After refusing to pay and calling the cops, he fell in love with a picture. That photo of a woman mysteriously appeared on his desk. He couldn't lift his eyes off of her. Upon research, he learned the woman was actually dead since 1984, but that didn't diminish his unnatural love for her. His mind was taken by magic. It was clouded. He already had a wife, but he was still obsessed. His wife tried to get rid of the picture, but it kept popping up everywhere. This lasted until the rude customer stabbed his wife and then hung himself. He left a note expressing his love for that woman in the picture. My friend's cousin wanted a money spell. He got it. Now, he is happy with his new wife. He paid in gold bars and there was no problems. He briefly described shadow figures with horns roaming around the premises on his way out, and a few child ghosts in the window. He had nightmares for weeks until they ceased. Indeed, not a person to mess with, not someone to visit. And that's why that witch has no friends, except the Black Wolf. Seasons of the Witch. Let's get straight into that. It was only old Mrs. Whitehill who noticed. When the well in her property began to produce bad water, she knew then that the season had come. Mrs. Whitehill lived alone on the same farmhouse her family had lived on for generations. Her children had long since left, and the day that she brought up the first bucket of cloudy, foul-smelling water, she immediately packed a bag and headed into town proper to stay with her sister. That same night she brings out her rosary and goes to church. Father Daniel says, You must understand why the church would be reluctant to make a statement of this sort. Is there nothing that can be done, though? Father Daniels nods gravely. You may want to stay out of the town proper until the season passes. You think the same things will happen? They'll think it's a person. They always do. That was in August. The Indian summer in Culver Landing that year was unbearably hot and even more humid, and had begun to stretch into September. It was the 10th of summer when Megan Lewis was the witch's sign in the sky. She didn't think anything of it at the time. She was more focused on not tensing up and trusting the other cheerleaders to catch her as she descended. She was thinking of it a few minutes later, though, after the muscles in her arms gave out when she was basing the same stunt, and the air was pierced with Bitsy Lee's shriek and a sickening crunch when she hit the ground. All of the cheerleaders went to visit her in hospital the next week. Her neck was broken, and the doctor said she would never walk again and was lucky she could still speak. Megan never forgot the look Bitsy kept giving her all over the tubes. The look that said, "This is all your fault. Why wasn't it you?" The first day of October, someone threw a rock at Marcy Rockwell, the homeless woman who lived in a tent down by the lake. The oppressive heat continued into the autumn, and was to blame when most of the crops grown in the town proper began to rot on the vine. Mr. Brown was barely scraping by as it was. The tears that fell from his eyes when his fingers went straight through the tops of his pumpkin could have watered plants that were unblighted. It was as if the land had somehow become barren. Mrs. Miller on Smith Street's twins was stillborn in the middle of the month. A pipe in the right price grocery store burst, ruining most of its stock. Management decided to point fingers. They claimed that the fresh market across town had been still in its business for too long, and it could no longer afford to keep up its maintenance budget. Fresh Market fired back that it had lost much of its stock due to the local blights, and since Right Price could afford to bring their merchandise in from outside town, then it really didn't have the right to complain. This issue took up much of the town hall meeting called the week before Halloween. This displaced the subject that had been the intent of the meeting, County Sheriff Jim Jackson's concern at a rapidly rising rate of violent crime in town. At the church on Sunday, Father Daniels tried to give a sermon on the importance of mercy and meekness. Few attended, and their voices still whispered. The week of Halloween proper, the humidity broke and the temperatures dropped drastically. The previous year, Marcy Rockwell had been sheltered at the church for the winter. This year, she woke on Devil's Night to find someone had lit her tent on fire. She took to sleeping in the park instead. There were nearly no jack-o'-lanterns that year. Mr. Brown's pumpkins had once been the pride of the town's autumn. He was currently counting the days until he was foreclosed on. Halloween night proper, Sheriff Jackson responded to 14 separate violent assaults. 10-year-old Glenn Hartford eventually succumbed to his injuries, having been attacked by a group of older kids with a brick. Only Jenny Arthur's stepfather had managed to get arrested that night, though that would do anything to save the right in her right eye. The next day, Billy and Abigail Williams inexplicably walked out of the house in the earliest part of the morning. They both made their way outside of the development towards the lake, walking straight past the burned remains of Marcy Rockwell's tent, onto the newly frozen lake, and out onto the thin surface, far enough until it broke between their shared weight, and they plunged into the depths, still holding hands. The William twins' mother latched onto the remains of the tent. "Why do we ever let her stay here?" she cried out in grief. "All she does is hang around the lake all summer, scaring the children and bothering families. She could have set the fire herself, and also, we would have to take her in again this year." Marcy had slept in the equipment shed at the high school the night of the twins' death. The night of All Saints' Day, she found it locked. All of the doorways in town, it seemed, had been padlocked that night, and, in the chilling November air, Marcy found she had nowhere to go, forced to contend with wandering the streets of town only by her exercise for warmth. Father Daniels would have welcomed her in that night after the All Souls' Day Mass. He decided he would seek her out in the streets and give her a place to sleep again. He left the church following the end of Mass along with his small congregation, and was shocked to step past Marcy's corpse on the steps of the church. The rope around her neck had apparently been the cause of death, but her attacker had apparently not found that enough, and the remains of her tattered clothes were still smouldering and smoking, and her skin charred as the church-going crowd split and walked around where she lay. Father Daniels looked to the November sky. Is this enough for you, witch? One more life blamed. But still, the freezing air remained. Wow. Hope you guys enjoyed that witch-themed compilation there. Something a little bit different. Tomorrow night, do tune in for Vampire Night, a Saturday night vampire compilation. Please do, as ever, like, comment, and share. And remember, guys, if you're going to have an argument with someone, make sure it's not a witch, or a wizard, or a dogman. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.